Welcome to this new podcast from the Cultural Center. We're undertaking a deep dive today into something really fascinating, a sort of paradox, actually. How did the 20th century, a time that, well, philosophically, politically kind of declared the death of God, how did it still manage to produce art that feels so profoundly spiritual, so full of intense yearning? And the backdrop, as our sources really lay it out, was just brutal. This was the century often described as lacerated and lacerating, a real slaughterhouse, where massive ideological shifts fueled just monumental violence.
Yeah, and that philosophical angle is crucial. You have to start with Nietzsche, right? His famous line, God is dead, from the gay science. But the key thing is, it's not really about God as some entity literally dying. It's more about the elimination of mystery, that connection to something infinite, taking that out of the human way of seeing things, out of desire itself. One source draws this really striking comparison. Think about the Middle Ages. If you somehow remove God then, society just collapses. Everything stops. But today, you remove the divine, the possibility of mystery. Does anything actually change in our daily lives? Not really. Your phone works, the economy chugs along. The only thing that would cause a collapse now is if you took away the technology. And that's the huge shift the art is grappling with, this feeling that the divine has sort of vanished from the world of the living.
And the numbers reflecting that violence are just staggering. World War I, World War II, the camps, countless conflicts after 1950, the victims of communist regimes. We're talking hundreds of millions dead. The implication seems pretty clear. When a society loses that anchor to objective truth, maybe to the divine, the ethical guardrails just seem to fall away.
Exactly. And it's within that trauma, that huge vacuum, that the real artists had to work. They couldn't ignore it. They expressed what one source calls the ferida, the wound. They showed that profound lack, that deep nostalgia, because the connection to the infinite felt shattered. So our mission today, really, is to see how they navigated that, how they searched for what felt lost.
Okay, let's try and unpack that. If Nietzsche sort of diagnosed the trauma philosophically, how did artists actually show that brokenness on canvas? If God is dead, and like he said, there are no longer facts, only interpretations, which, quickly turn into ideologies, how does that fracture reality in art?
Well, you see an almost immediate shift in Western art. For centuries, the goal was often a total relational view of reality, everything connected.
Yeah.
Suddenly it moves toward this intensely fragmented vision. Even someone like Salvador Dali, a surrealist, openly wrote about wanting to contribute to the total discredit of the world of reality. It actually became an artistic aim for some, to sort of sabotage objective truth.
And the figure who really ignites this crisis, who throws that grenade into the art world in 1907, is Pablo Picasso. That's Picasso. His painting, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, that's the moment things really break open, isn't it?
It is, and it's more than just a style change. Critics at the time pointed out that Picasso seemed to specifically want to destructure the complete idea of man born with Christianity. That idea of humanity having inherent beauty, a kind of freedom derived from the divine. That's what came under attack. And the focus really zeroed in on the human face, which for so long had been seen as, the image of the divine.
There's that quote calling Picasso the thief of forms, which sounds pretty harsh. Was that just maybe an older critic who didn't quite get the modern movement?
It does sound harsh, but you have to look at who said it. It comes from Marc Chagall, G-A-H-L, another absolute master, who actually shared studio space with Picasso for a time. In Chagall's description, it's visceral. He said Picasso created portraits with a kind of diabolical exaltation, deliberately deforming faces until they resembled the face of death. For Chagall, it wasn't just about style. It felt like a kind of spiritual violence, a deliberate reduction of life, of the divine image, down to just schemes and fragments.
Wow, okay, that really does raise the stakes. So if fragmentation was a diagnosis reflecting this torn-apart world, what was the artistic response? Who tried to offer a prescription?
Exactly, because even as that deconstruction was happening, other major artists immediately started trying to re-engage with the spiritual. They pushed back against pure materialism, against just realism. They were searching for some kind of mystery beyond what you could just see.
Which leads us, I think, to Paul Klee, pronounced K-L-E, one of the great thinkers, theorists of this time. His work is so interesting because the landscape itself seems to become transparent. It's not just a picture of a place. It feels like the presence of the infinite shining through the place.
Klee really insisted on that. He said art must speak of that mysterious zone from which the roots of our being spring.
And he articulated that core human struggle beautifully in his Confessions on Creativity back in 1920. That spiritual tension, he said, makes man half prisoner and half winged, always aware of this tragic incompleteness.
And he saw the artist's role as almost a mediator, even a prophet maybe, someone whose job wasn't just to copy what's visible, but to unseal the eyes upon the invisible. But that raises a question, doesn't it? If the artist takes on that kind of prophetic mantle, isn't there a danger they end up founding a new, maybe purely individualistic religion, sort of replacing the priest? That is absolutely the risk, the potential limit of this kind of secular spiritual quest. When the search is purely intellectual, purely individual, it often struggles to sustain itself or to build community. And we see that kind of intellectual isolation perhaps most acutely when we look at the Russian masters. They were attempting this search while living under this intensely communal, yet fiercely materialistic ideology of communism.
Right. What happens when the state itself is actively denying the spiritual, but the artist inside still feels that pull, that demand? Let's look at Kazimir Malevich, that's Malevich, the father of suprematism.
Malevich's response was radical. He wanted to somehow illuminate what he saw as the world's materialistic darkness by completely refusing reality as it appeared. He flat out stated art as a relationship with reality is a fiction, a lie. His answer was pure, unadulterated abstraction.
And the ultimate statement of that is his black square on white background. I think a lot of people see that and just think, okay, it's a black square. Why is this so important? But our sources describe it as nothing less than the icon of the invisible God.
Yeah, the thinking behind it, the kind of embedded theology is fascinating. The white background, that's the pure light of the divine, totally unknowable, maybe too intense to grasp. And the black square is physicality. It's matter. Matter conceals the divine light, but in the very act of hiding it, it paradoxically makes the desire for it even stronger. There's an analogy one source uses, thinking of Leopardi's poem, L'Infinito. The hedge blocks the view of the horizon.
Right.
And because the infinite is hidden, the longing for it just becomes overwhelming. The black square functions like that hedge. It embodies that intense desire born from concealment.
That quest for pure spiritual communication, that definitely brings us to Wassily Kandinsky, who literally wrote the book on it, The Spiritual in Art. He really seems to embrace that priestly or sacerdotal function that Klieg talked about.
Kandinsky absolutely did. He wanted to liberate painting completely from depicting material reality. He tried to assimilate it to the purity of music. He even assigned specific musical tones to colors, trying to create these visual chromatic symphonies that would guide the viewer towards, well, mystical insight. But the limitation is similar to Klieg's, perhaps even more pronounced. What this kind of art promotes is a very abstract spiritualism. Yeah. It's beautiful, it's intelligent, but it's ultimately searching for, a God without flesh, a God without a face.
And that idea, that search for an abstract, faceless God, it takes a really poignant, almost devastating turn when we get to the American painter Mark Rothko. That's R-O-X-K-O, famous for those huge, immersive color field paintings, intensely luminous.
Rothko's work, yes. Those massive panels with their glowing veils of color, they're deeply rooted in his Jewish heritage. They really suggest meditation, contemplation. His work is often seen as trying to represent the Shekinah, that concept of the veiled, luminous, yet ultimately unknowable presence of God.
They feel like the veil in the Temple of Jerusalem, don't they? A place where you might sense God's presence, maybe hear his voice, but never see his face directly. There's such weight in that search.
Yes, immense weight. And the fact that this search for the absolute was so powerful, so all-consuming for him, yet felt so fundamentally unfulfilled. It's tragic. Rothko's art pulses with this unfulfilled desire for the absolute, for that face-to-face vision of God, and the persistent denial of that final vision, that refusal of the face in its abstract forms. It's hard not to connect it to his eventual tragic suicide. It really illustrates the potentially destructive power of that infinite desire when it remains purely abstract, when it can't find an incarnation.
It does seem that the artists who pursued this very abstract metaphysical God often ended up in places of intense isolation, sometimes tragedy. So let's shift now to two other masters who seem to find the spiritual much closer to hand, grounding it more in the visible world, though in really different ways. Let's start with Marc Chagall, G-A-H-L.
Chagall is so distinctive. His painting really condenses this contemplation of the mystery of Adonai, but an Adonai who becomes proximate, available to humanity. He famously called the Bible the main source of poetry of all time. For him, it wasn't just ancient history. It was living poetry that made the infinite tangible real.
He seems to embody that idea of invisibilia per visibilia, seeing the invisible through the visible. How does he actually do that? How does the transcendent show up in his paintings of Russian villages and everyday life.
He shows the divine manifesting as this immense sign, this huge phenomenon, right within the reality he knew intimately. The smell of his home, the local shoemaker's house, the life of the shtetl. It's like the burning bush or the pillar of cloud or that still small voice in the scriptures. The mystery isn't somewhere else, abstract and far away. It's immediate, it's proximate. It doesn't require some huge philosophical leap. It's just there, present within reality itself.
And what's really striking is how he treats the figure of Christ. Chagall, himself a devout Jew, saw Christ as the perfect Jew, somehow the synthesis of all Jewish history and suffering.
Absolutely. Look at his crucifixion paintings, like the famous white crucifixion. Christ, who Chagall always depicts with a nimbus, clearly marking him as divine, becomes the focal point where all the threads of Jewish suffering, exile, migration converge. You often see Christ depicted wearing Jewish prayer garments, the tefillin or talit. Chagall referred to Christ as the companion of my sorrow. He saw in him an incarnate presence of God, sharing the specific suffering of his own people.
Okay, and finally, let's turn to Henri Matisse. Matisse. His art definitely asks that question about the infinite, but maybe seems hesitant. Stops just short of surrendering to a god with a face. His early work, of course, was scandalous. Those pure, flat, almost clashing colors, the critics called him a fauve, a wild beast.
Right, and interestingly, Matisse later found huge inspiration in Catalan medieval art. He apparently regretted not seeing it earlier, saying it would have saved 30 years of research. But the really radical shift, the personal one, came much later through his relationship with his nurse and model, Monique, who became Sister Jacques Marie, a woman of really profound, simple faith.
That relationship seems absolutely critical here, doesn't it? Matisse apparently insisted he was the prophet, guiding people to the Creator through light and color. But Monique gently pointed out the difference.
Yes, she highlighted that her faith was rooted in a commitment to the church, to Christ. His, she felt, was more of an instinctual religiosity, a powerful feeling, but maybe lacking that specific commitment.
And you can almost see that tension captured in the famous Icarus image from his jazz series.
Exactly. There's an interpretation, by Don Giussani actually, that sees Icarus as symbolizing that immense but ultimately incomplete human desire for the infinite, that longing to fly towards the sun, the absolute. But the crucial detail is the red heart on Icarus's chest. That heart signifies he's not just falling tragically, he's tied to something, dependent on something beyond himself. And it's that very dependency, that desire that keeps him suspended, preventing a complete crash. It's the desire itself holding him.
And this whole relationship, this dialogue, ultimately led to Matisse's final great work, the Vence Chapel.
Yes, the chapel. It's dominated by this incredible white light, contrasted with the stained glass yellow symbolizing divinity, blue representing that tension towards the infinite. And the light converges on the figure of the divine majesty, Jesus with open arms. But even here, at the culmination of his life's work, the saints, like St. Dominic and Jesus himself, are rendered as, well, abstract outlines, without faces. It reveals Matisse's final, inherent limit. He gets so close, but the identity remains abstract, somehow unincarnated. He couldn't quite bring himself to that face-to-face encounter.
So we've traced this arc through the century, from the shattering fragmentation to these incredible, sublime heights of abstraction. And the search kept pushing, didn't it? Even past Matisse's limit. You think of someone like Yves Klein-Klein chasing the absolute with a signature blue Klein, trying to connect with the divine with absolutely no mediation, not even form itself.
Or Lucio Fontana, maybe even more violently, with his End of God series, slashing those oval canvases, a deliberate attempt to break the old ways of depicting God, declaring God fundamentally invisible, unrepresentable. And this quest, this feeling, continues. You see it right up to contemporary artists like Claudio Parmigiani. His work seems to express what's been called a mysticism without faith.
Those works he does, the delocalizations, those sort of ghostly smoke imprints left on walls after something's been removed, they feel like they're documenting a lost presence, a memory fading. His art feels like a question mark just hanging there in the void, documenting the loss but not really offering an answer.
And that brings us back, I think, to the essential paradox we started with. This incredibly powerful 20th century secular art, whether through violent deconstruction or intense spiritual searching, ultimately just highlights this profound nostalgia, this ache for the God they supposedly proclaim dead. It seems the human need for the infinite, for meaning beyond the material, simply cannot be erased.
It's incredibly powerful to realize that even Nietzsche himself, the philosopher who sort of kicked it all off, seemed to feel this at the end. In his final writings, he cried out, "Oh, return, my unknown God, my pain, my last happiness."
Yeah. So this deep dive, I hope, shows that this desire for the infinite is just indelible. It's part of being human. And that really sets the stage for where we want to go next time.
Looking at how Christian artists within that same turbulent century responded, how they affirmed what St. Paul told the Athenians when he saw their altar to the unknown God, that this God, maybe, is not actually far from any of us.
So considering the incredible works we've touched on today, from Picasso's broken figures to Rothko's luminous voids, Matisse's yearning Icarus, here's something to think about. Does that deep search for the divine ultimately require a solitary, perhaps intellectual quest? Or is it only truly satisfied, truly fulfilled through something shared, a communal experience, maybe even an encounter? Something for you to ponder until our next deep dive.